Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jews on Film podcast. Thank you for tuning in again to us. My name is Harry Adensasser. I am a Jew who loves movies. I'll slip this in right now. I was a film major in college, so that's a little bit of my background, and I'm excited to talk to you about, a specifically Jewish movie that we are watching this week, Uncut Gems, a movie that I would say I didn't think of so much as a Jewish movie upon the first time I watched it, but revisiting it for this podcast was very Jewish, and I'm very excited to break that down with you. And with me, as always, is Daniel. Why don't you introduce yourself, Daniel?
Sure, Harry, no problem. I'm Daniel Zana. I'm a filmmaker, video editor, and Jew as well, and someone who likes to listen to podcasts and here to talk Uncut Gems, like Harry said. Boy, what a movie. I remember seeing this movie in the theaters when it came out 2 years ago. I was seeing it at the, I'm based in Seattle. And so I saw it at the Northgate Mall with some friends. And it was just very intense. Like the whole movie is just a adrenaline rush all the way through. And it doesn't really calm down until the credits at the end.
Yeah.
And it starts out real like calm, or not really. We'll get into it in a second, but I feel like it just like from the get-go, the first thing, it's just, intensity all the way through, and there's lulls, but I was going to say, you can call it, adrenaline, intensity. I would go so far as to say it's a stressful movie. It was not an easy rewatch. I actually watched it a couple hours before we're recording tonight. And I'm not sure if I've sort of come down from the anxiety I've been feeling, for the last couple hours since I watched it. It starts off high, like you said, and it never really lets up through, the final moments. Oh, yeah. And I feel like a lot of that is the story itself, but then there's so many other, decisions that were made in the edit or in the sound design or the soundtrack, where it's just like really swelling music and cutting, when Howard's like on the phone and he's clicking between line 1 and line 2 and line 3 and people are on the phone with him. And it's just, there's a lot going on at all times. And there's very rarely a time when it's not like so claustrophobic or just, there's not a lot of time to breathe in this movie. I think the only time that there's a little bit of quiet is when Howard's like in the trunk of his car.
Exactly right.
Not only are we going to have a spoiler warning about the plot, we will have a Talmud warning that there will be Talmud discussed in this podcast.
Exactly.
Harry, can you give us the IMDb synopsis for this film?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just read what IMDb says. And this is not a promotion for IMDb, although I use it almost every day and it's a great app. But I'll read, there's actually a couple of plot synopses here. So I'll just read one of them that I found. And it basically says, in New York City's chaotic and corrupt diamond market, the gemstone dealer and gambling addict Howard Ratner is owing money to almost everyone, including his brother-in-law Arno. A serial adulterer, incorrigible gambler, and all-around con artist, Howard thinks he can finally get out of the tight spot when he gets his hands on a block of rare Ethiopian black opal, the means to clear his ever-rising debts. But the star Boston Celtics player, Kevin Garnett, has already taken a shine to the precious uncut gem. Can Ratner juggle his family, a pair of thuggish collectors, his work, and his master plan before things get nasty? And that's where the synopsis ends, but I'll answer that question with a spoiler. Not so much. I would say he doesn't manage to juggle it all appropriately.
Yeah, it's a perpetual thrill ride, like we said. And but I feel like one thing that is, it's an interesting choice to cast Adam Sandler in this movie. Not the first time that I've seen Adam Sandler succeed in like a drama role. Like this reminded me a lot of parts of Punch Drunk Love, which is directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. Shout out to the 818 for all you Valley listeners. But I feel like a lot of the parts that reminded me me of Punch Drunk Love was that in that movie as well, Adam Sandler plays Barry Egan, who's kind of like this schlubby loser kind of guy who's also pursued at one point by thugs and by the mob or, Valley mob, but still. And just the way that he reacts to it is not as brave as he is in this way, where he's like fighting these people in this movie and he doesn't back down. But he brings like a unique perspective as a comedy person. People who know Adam Sandler as, The Water Boy, Happy Gilmore, all these other movies and all his comedy records and things like that. And to see him kind of like twist expectations a little bit and play this sort of character is really interesting.
I definitely agree with you there. I think part of his persona, that comedic soft persona, is someone you wouldn't necessarily take seriously for a number of reasons, like not only as someone who you think is joking the whole time, but also someone who might not be able to stand up for himself. And I think that really informs his character, where he seems like this sort of, little guy, outcast in society, who's always kind of defending himself, like fighting for, what he feels like is right. And I definitely think the casting of Adam Sandler certainly informs how we feel about this character, and why I think it becomes so difficult to not give him the sympathy that, Adam Sandler generally evokes from an audience, but Howard Ratner, in this film certainly does not. Part of the through line of the movie is that everything that happens to him is somewhat self-inflicted, I would say, if not mostly self-inflicted. There are like opportunities throughout the film where he makes a bad choice and has an opportunity for redemption and just doesn't take it and goes the other way and doubles down. And, this is certainly a gambling movie before we even talk about it being a Jewish film. I would say that's one of the main through lines of, his whole character.
Something that I thought about as the film progresses and bad things keep happening to him is that it's sort of like Job in a sense, where like the shit hits the fan so many times I lose count, and he's just so optimistic that this is going to be the time that I'm going to win that bet, or this is going to be the time that, something good will happen to me. And he's very optimistic. It's only towards the end of the movie where he finally breaks down. And, he's got his nose plugged up with tissues and he's talking to his girlfriend, Jules. He just kind of breaks down at that point. But prior to that, he's just very optimistic that everything's kind of going to work out. And he just keeps it going. It's very intense.
No question about that. I love your comparison to Job. I read an interview actually that the Safdie brothers, the directors of the film, were doing, and they were talking about this sort of Jewish tradition of characters who have to learn through suffering and sort of repeated suffering. And that's obviously, that's a huge part of the Job story, but a lot of these characters, and the question of whether Howard really learns much, by the end of the movie, I'm not sure if we'd agree that he really comes out of here a stronger character, stronger morally and ethically, but he certainly is suffering, throughout the film.
Yeah. And, so the movie starts out in what we see as Ethiopia, and there's someone being led out of the mines, and two other miners kind of sneak in as they're bringing this wounded character out, and they go in and they're chipping away at part of a wall, and from it comes out like a black opal stone, which we're told is incredibly rare, incredibly valuable. And, they're looking at it and it's shiny and everything. And it starts out and we kind of do this like hyper zoom going into the gem all the way through. And that's when the credits start. And then it sort of slowly morphs into a colonoscopy reading from Howard Ratner. And we zoom out and we see Howard in a vulnerable state. I'll revise my statement. I think Howard getting a colonoscopy and being in the trunk of the car are the only like two calm moments in the film. Everything else is just like really, but what's more Jewish than getting a colonoscopy, huh?
No, 100%. And I'll remind our listeners, it doesn't just sort of turn into him, in the process of this colonoscopy, but, we go from inside the gem to, I think, inside his colon, right? Yeah. There's sort of this dramatic shot where they're kind of pulling back to a screen that's, all the way up inside there. So this movie is not afraid to shy away from some certain graphic images.
Yeah. And, and then we're introduced to Howard's crazy world. He's running around, calling people on his cell phone, and he gets in and we're introduced to his coworkers, so Howard is a married man. He's married to a woman named Dina, who's played by Idina Menzel. And he also works with a woman named Jules. And Jules is also his girlfriend on the side, let's say. And so he has a separate apartment in New York City. Jules is played by Julia Fox. I thought it was interesting that Howard deals in Jules, but he also is dating Jules. I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but
no, you know what? It feels like a not so subtle way of saying he's sort of married to his work in a certain way.
Very good. Yeah, I like that.
Because obviously, the same way that this profession is sort of the cause for the crumbling of his marriage, which is sort of a big theme. He's sort of in this place where he's moved into his own apartment. He's in the process of getting divorced from his wife, but they haven't really spoken to the kids about it. So he's sort of in that, intermittent space. And, it's certainly both the Jules and, Julia herself are pulling him away to a certain extent.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. And then after dealing with a couple customers, we meet Damani, who's played by Lakeith Stanfield. And Damani is sort of a questionable character to Howard in terms of bringing in new business like other folks, in the hip hop world, as well as pro athletes like Kevin Garnett, who we'll see later in the film. But, I think it's interesting that the way that there's a fish that's delivered to Howard's door while Kevin Garnett is visiting later on. And the fish, inside the fish is where this black opal, we find out that Howard has acquired this black opal gem, and it comes in through a fish, which I think is very much like Jonah in a way,
what? Yeah.
There's even like an old, I feel like there's an old,
if you didn't say it, I was about to, it just came to mind as you were explaining that, that there's a famous story in the Talmud where it talks about this character who was, there was this character that was told he was this sort of evil man, and he was told that all of his money would be given to this, poor and righteous Jew someday. And he was so terrified that his money would be liquidated that he decides he's going to invest in this, convert all of his money into this one gem, this huge gem, similar to the black opal at the center of the story. And he would, I think, hide it in his hat maybe, or just keep it in his pocket, and so that he would never lose it. And the story goes that one day that gem is, I think a strong gust of wind comes, it flies off of his hat, off of his, out of his pocket, and lands in the ocean, and it's swallowed by a fish, which is incredible, because I really think that this is, sort of a clear reference to that, because what happens is, the poor man buys that fish, right before Shabbos. It's this big thing. He gets the last fish in the market, and when he opens it up, he's rewarded by finding this huge jewel, sort of in the center of the fish, and just so visually similar to what happens, with Howard here. So I really think that's an intentional reference by the Safdie brothers.
Nice. Yeah. I'm going to revise my statement and say it's not Jonah. It's more likely the exact story from the Talmud.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome.
And before we get too into it, I know that usually we talk about, how Jewish this film is from a behind the scenes and in front of the camera perspective. So like we mentioned, Adam Sandler, a Jew. We also have the Safdie brothers, who are Jewish. They're Sephardic Jews, I believe. And,
yes,
and so we also have cameos by like Judd Hirsch, who plays Adam Sandler's father-in-law. We have the fat Jewish shows up in a scene. I looked up some of the other folks. They did not appear to be members of the tribe, but I could be wrong. But it's just very interesting that there's a distinction drawn. There's another character, Eric Bogosian, who plays Arno, which is Howard's brother-in-law. He's very much not Jewish, where they go to the point of pointing that out at the Passover Seder, which is another interesting thing that they feature a Passover Seder at the film. But, this film also is like very Jewish in its comedy. Like, I feel like there's like little moments within this very tense film. And I'd like to play a clip for you now. Basically, the setting is that Howard has lent this gem to Kevin Garnett as a way to get him good luck during a game. And one of Howard's coworkers, Damani, is tasked with bringing the gem back, but he is not very reliable throughout the film. He doesn't answer his phone. He doesn't answer his texts except when it suits him. And so now they're in Philly for a practice. They've driven all the way to Philly.
Who's that? Is that KG? Tell him we're here. We're coming in.
Yo, you got to calm your happy ass down.
Are we going inside the facility, or we're going to meet him out here?
Just chill the fuck out, man.
I hope we see Rondo in there. I'd love to tell him thank you for dropping all those dimes.
No, that's not. They busy. And what the fuck is it with you Jewish niggas in basketball anyway? Huh?
I'll have you know, the first 2 points scored in the NBA was a Jew.
Yeah. What, Fred Flintstein?
No. Ozzie Scheckman, 1946, played for the Knicks. Here we go. Yeah, this is where the big boys play.
And there's like little scenes throughout the film where there's small interludes, and like you wouldn't think that there's a lot of opportunity to inject little jokes like that. These are like throwaway lines that if you blink, you miss it. But just goes to show that like there's a little bit of Jewish humor everywhere you look. Yeah.
Yeah, no question about that. I think when you bring up the if you blink, you miss it, it just when I was watching this movie this time, and I was certainly keeping, a score of just sort of like how Jewish it is, in its content, because, we spoke about the Safdie brothers, that they're Jewish. Adam Sandler's Jewish. There's a sort of a Jewish sensibility in terms of like, the themes of suffering. And, you can definitely read Jewishness into there from a sort of thematic and external level. But within the movie itself, like there is so much Jewish content, more so than I remembered watching the first time. I remember this was like on the short list of I don't remember if it was nominated, but it definitely was considered, one of the Oscar best films of the year it came out. And I didn't remember just how Jewish it was. And in some senses, in a very obvious way, characters calling each other Jews. And in the scene you just played, we have Damani character asking, what is it about you Jews that you guys love basketball so much? And that's, everyone watching that recognizes we're talking about Jews here. But there are so many lines in the movie that are just kind of like you were saying, if you missed it. If you don't know what you're looking for, you won't hear it. That I was just like, these are like deep cut Jewish ideas that not everyone probably is aware of. One that comes to mind now, and one that I actually read the Safdie brothers were very keen on including in the film was, there's a scene where Howard's girlfriend, Jules, shows him a tattoo that she got of his name. And when he sees it, his first reaction is, oh, now we can't get buried together, which I can imagine if you don't have a contextual understanding of, the concept of Jews aren't supposed to be buried in a cemetery. If they get a tattoo, you're not supposed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery if you have a tattoo on your body. Right. That was something that instantly I recognized, what the pain that Howard's character was feeling when he said that line. But it was just the kind of thing that you can imagine a lot of people didn't understand what was going on there, could appreciate the humor in the scene. But there are real Jewish deep cuts in this film that, you don't really see in a mainstream movie so often.
Yeah. And his reaction wasn't quite like shock or anything. It was more just like, oh God, what did you do? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I got another example of that, right?
Bitch ass.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Man, this is
Howard,
what do I got?
Looking at the results
shit,
here
man.
for colonoscopy, so we're good. You're all good. Everything
bitch
came
ass
back
motherfucker.
Gotcha.
Man. Fuck you in that goddamn
Clean
phone call, nigga.
100%.
You man.
You said it's good?
Yeah, I said you're all
Oh,
clean.
good. Thank you. That's a relief.
Relax. This is just
You ain't fucking listening to
My
me, man.
father
All right?
fucking died from it, so of course.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, but given your family history.
I
this is
know.
something you gotta
Jews
take
and
into
colon
account.
cancer. What is that? I thought we were the chosen people.
Yeah. One thing when watching this stuff, watching this scene we just played is like, one thing I noticed about Howard is like with eye contact, he doesn't do it very much, right? So he's on the phone in the beginning. His colleague, Yossi, resigns or quits after 8 years of being there. He's talking to him. He's pouring his heart out. At some point, I think Kevin Garnett's security guards had roughed him up and he just didn't want to be part of the business anymore. He doesn't look, he's totally just on the phone in his own world, totally distracted, multitasking, whatever. And similarly, when Damani is confronting him in the office about things, he's not making eye contact, totally just in the zone, on the phone, multitasking, doing something else.
I think what you're saying is so true. I think it's so telling of his character that he's never able to kind of be present, with anyone else or even with himself in a moment. He's always looking ahead. He's always looking for the next thing. He gets the money. He wins $100,000. He's investing it. He's putting it down on another gamble to turn it into $1 million. And, he finally gets his hands on like a loan from someone and he takes that money and pawns it for something else. And it's just like, there's no sense of being, present in any given scene. It's just, he's always, focusing on everyone else. And we see it through all the other characters in his life. They know they never get his attention. You were talking about Yessi and the way that he quit, and Armani knows he's not even looking at him. And, he's like talking to, his ex-wife throughout the film. And every time that she says something to him, he's always just like clearly of another mind. He never understands how she's actually feeling.
However, when Howard needs something from her, this is how he talks to her.
Yeah, I know I fucked up. I know.
Yeah, you fucked up. You are a fuck up. And I'm not having this conversation.
Listen, please stop. Just stop for 1 second and just look at me. Look in my eyes. And they'll tell you what I'm feeling. Please. What are you thinking? What? Tell me. I know. What?
Your face is so stupid.
Okay.
Yeah. So Howard tries to be all serious with Dina and she just laughs him off and he makes this like dumb face to her.
That's really cool. The way you were talking about how his inability to like make eye contact with anyone, and his plea to her is not, he doesn't even say anything. He just says, look in my face. I want to look in your eyes, which I think for us, it does feel a little bit vulnerable from him. You know, we know that that's not something that he always does. And to her, it's just like, why should this be a big deal? Like, you're barely meeting the minimum. I want you to do so much more than just like finally give me eye contact. But you know, that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, to him, it's like, oh, this is a big deal. And he's got this like dopey face. And it really doesn't really cut it for her. She's not into it. She's done with him. This is at a point in the film later on where him and Jules have had a falling out. And at that point, they are on the rock. So he's at a Passover Seder at Dina's house, and Dina's dad is Judd Hirsch. And
I want to take a minute to talk about this Passover Seder, because this is, you know, obviously the way I was saying, there are certain things you just don't see in mainstream films. I mean, to have an entire scene devoted to the Passover Seder, and, you know, for even characters throughout the film to refer to it as, you know, Pesach is coming up, you know, like the Hebrew version of it, where people are really, you know, taking this seriously. I think it was striking to, you know, watch that all play out in the film. And I think it has, you know, both just grounds this in a very Jewish world. You know, this is like authentically Jewish to a certain extent. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on how you think some of the themes, you know, of Passover, and maybe this is where we can have our little, you know, big stretch ideas that we always to throw in here. And just see how that, because I had some thoughts about how this sort of connects to him as a character. So I wanted to hear first
how Passover connects to this.
How Passover, how the Seder, exactly.
Well, I mean, the beginning reminded me of like Egypt, you know, in a sense that like you have people who are sort of slaves to the mind at the beginning, like the Jews were slaves in Egypt kind of thing. And then also just, you know, this whole ability for someone like Howard to pay a certain amount of money for this gem from these Ethiopian people and then sell it to way more money. And you know, the idea of like rich and poor, that's the thing. You know, a lot of people wish him happy Passover, things like that. In terms of like a direct connection to Passover, I feel like we're getting into Laffy Taffy stretch territory a little bit.
Always.
You know, I'm more on the stereotype piece, which we can talk about in a minute, but I'm curious to hear about how you thought it did or did not connect to Passover. Other than being like explicitly at a Passover Seder, so there's a connection, you know?
Exactly. I mean, I think what you were just saying about that dynamic of sort of like slavery to freedom, you know, and I think that's actually very present, you know, that's a big theme of the Passover Seder is, you know, documenting the sort of ancient Jews, how they went from being, you know, slaves to getting their absolute freedom. And I think, you know, that reminded me of the conversation that that Howard has at some point about, you know, the opal. I think Kevin Garnett is pressing him about how much he charged from the Ethiopian miners. And he was just like, no, there's like a big deal for them. And it kind of frames, there's sort of two Jews on the side of this, you know, exchange of this sort of like much poorer, you know, group of individuals selling to someone who's very wealthy on the other side. And it's a little bit of an inverted, you know, Passover dynamic to see them on both sides. But it also had me thinking a little bit. I was reading about how, you know, a lot of Jews sort of like weren't able to cultivate, you know, wealth for many years. Obviously, they were considered a lower part of society, and we're talking, you know, for years through like centuries ago, you know, when Christian dominated, you know, Western countries. And I think I was reading the Safdie brothers were talking about how Jews have used sort of like wealth and, you know, owning things as a sort of marker of like their own individuality and of just like, as a sort of response to always feeling, you know, enslaved. It's like, now, you know, we're free. Now we can have a lot of possessions. And that's kind of what, you know, draws him, the ability to have money, the ability to spend money. So I think in light of what you were saying, that definitely to me felt like something that's going on here with this sort of Passover, you know, this dynamic of, you know, poverty to, you know, wealth, which I think Howard is on the verge of the entire film. At one moment he's up $100,000. The next moment he's in debt to, you know, a ton of people, you know, however many $1,000. So, you know, we're definitely playing with that balance.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we run into more of these colorful New York characters who work in the Diamond District, who know Howard. And we find out, oh no, it's not that he just owes Arno $100,000. He also owns this weirdo down the street. He owes him money. And then the other one pawned the ring and he still owes him this and that. So he basically owes money to everyone around town. And, you know, he even loops in his father-in-law to bid on the black opal against Kevin Garnett.
Right.
And so he gets him in the whole $200,000 nearly. Yeah, it's It's something else. And I feel like it's not even that Howard's looking for freedom, right? Because at a certain point in the film, he's up and he has a whole bunch of money in his hand. And the smart person would be like, oh, I owe someone this much money. Let me pay that off, pay this off, pay that off. He just turns around and spends it somewhere else. He really does have a gambling addiction.
He's enslaved to it.
He's a slave to the money, and he doesn't want to be free. I think he wants to just continue this sort of like hustle and just staying on the treadmill and just keeping the vibe going of just like
sort of underdog
looking for the next fix. And yeah. And like literally there's a couple times where he's like, he says, when he's like watching the game on the phone, he's like, oh, he's like has a physical sexual reaction from the fact that these like several times he's just.
There's a moment I was going to say, there's a moment when he's in the back of a car, I think. Yeah. And like he sees that he's winning and it does seem like he's orgasming. Like he's just having this, sort of sexual moment of just, excitement. And I definitely agree with you. That's why I think that's his most dominant relationship. He can't give enough to any of his other relationships with his wife, with his girlfriend, but that's sort of where it's all focused.
And he does worship Kevin Garnett. I mean, he's willing to part with this stone. He's willing to like polish his earrings for free. And I'm not sure like what that's all about. Like maybe because he worships sports so much that like a superhero like Kevin Garnett from this team that he likes or that he follows, the fact that he comes in, he's like a larger than life character, like physically, he's like maybe 7 feet tall or something like that next to little short Howard. But it's very interesting the way that he behaves, where he's willing to do anything for Kevin Garnett to the point where he's like, oh yeah, I would give it to you, but I have it on auction. It's like, you're really going to give this stone to someone that you spent $100,000 on? Like,
and part of that is just his recklessness, but 100%, I think a lot of it is like the thrill of it and his attraction to basketball. And what's so interesting is that you reminded me, I was reading in an interview about how the Safdies, I think they originally had wanted to make this movie a couple years earlier. And when they did, they were hoping to star Amari Stoudemire in it. He was, they're huge Knicks fans. He was on the Knicks at the time, but also he's famously a player who was Jewish or is Jewish. And I think after his basketball career has leaned more into his, religiousness, into his Judaism, and he moved to Israel for a long time afterwards. And I think they said that when they originally had what they had in mind for the character was there to be this sort of bond between, this is a basketball player that's also Jewish. I have this, real connection with him. And, Howard, a character who is like so seemingly, I think, proud of his Jewishness and like leans into his identity and what that means and all the stereotypes associated with that. So I can imagine some of that affection, would have been a little bit more obviously placed had it been Amari Stoudemire in the lead role instead of Kevin Garnett.
I want to play that scene you were just mentioning about Kevin Garnett and Howard sitting down to chat.
You gave some niggas from Ethiopia $100,000 for something you thought was worth $1 million. You don't see nothing wrong with that, Howard?
Ethiopian miners, you know what these fucking guys make? $100,000's 50 lifetimes for these fucking guys.
$1 million is more, is my point. You understand?
If you want to win by 1 point or fucking 30 points, KG, right? I see you out there when the fucking stadium's all booing you, you're 30 up, you're still going full tilt. Let's see what has Vegas got you guys at tonight? Take a look, let's see.
And at this point in the film, Howard places his sort of final bet of his life. Spoiler alert. This is the famous 6-way parlay that we'll talk about. But essentially, he's literally talking about something with Kevin Garnett, sitting him down in his office about the gem. And then all of a sudden, it quickly pivots to another bet, just so quickly. I do think one thing that we have not mentioned, which I thought was probably one of the more anxiety-inducing scenes, is when Howard goes to see his daughters play. And at this point, he's being harassed pretty aggressively by Arno and his thugs. And he's sitting down, completely distracted, texting. Damani has run off. We don't know where the gem is. We don't know where Damani is. And Howard is just totally fixated on where the gem is because he has to take it to an auction house because he's hoping to sell it in an auction and make a lot of money. Again, a gamble. And
always,
I thought it was interesting that his daughter's in a play, which I was not able to figure out what the play is, but her role in the film is that she's spewing coins out of her mouth. Like just, yeah.
She's right. I remember her character is sort of cursed with the blessing of getting to, anytime she speaks, gold is spewed out of her mouth. And it's a very subtle moment, but I know we both picked up on it where, Howard sort of rolls his eyes. He makes a face like, okay. And it's something that, I'm sure a lot of people picked up on too, but he's clearly, disturbed by the fact that, his Jewish family and this Jewish, his Jewish daughter is being cast in this role of someone who is spewing literal money out of her mouth.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting choice. And later on, Howard realizes that Arno's thugs are sitting behind him in the auditorium, rather. And he talks to them outside. He's got the balls to summon these two beefy guys into the hallway of his daughter's school. He bites one of them. He pushes the other one. He does not back down at all. And it's just a very interesting choice. Howard doesn't seem to back down from anything, it seems. And they chase him, they beat him. He gets in a car with Arno. Arno forces his thugs to strip him of his clothes, his watches, his bracelets, throw him in his trunk completely naked. And they leave his phone. So he ends up calling his wife, who's sitting in the auditorium watching her daughter. And Dina has to then rescue Howard completely naked in his Mercedes. So yeah, that's a fun scene.
I was about to say, there's certainly a lot going on in that scene. Yes. I mean, speaking to what you're talking about when he bit, the other character, I think I definitely took note of the fact that the person he bit says, he yells to his partner, he says, "The Jew bit me," which is one of those very explicit characterizations of him as this, sort of Jew character. And, some clear, that was just a clearly in your face kind of representation of that. But what's interesting is that, and I know I've been talking about, the Safdie brothers in this interview. I read one interview, but there was just a lot of gems in there, pun intended. But they talked about how like they just had seen so many characters. A lot of times when we think of that sort of Jewish character, that Jewish comedian, the sensibility we think of is this very meek sort of, small, scrawny character. And they said that they were excited to create, Howard as someone who was just like, he wouldn't take a punch without punching back. And he was very much going to fight for himself. And even when he was outnumbered and even when it was ill-advised, he was going to be like a strong, proud of his Jewishness and not sort of meek. And I think you see that in full display there when he bites the character and says, I think he even says to them, like, you guys want to go outside? And one of them is like, are you sure that's a good idea? Yeah. Like, that is not good for you. And he's just like, let's do it. Because he's like, he's not going to let them come to his turf and, stand down. So I certainly think we're seeing glimpses of the, strong Jewish character there.
Towards the end, he goes to the auction house. He finally gets his black opal stone back from Kevin Garnett. He gets the stone back from Damani right in the nick of time. He tries to get it appraised, and he thinks it's going to sell for at least $1 million. They end up appraising it for far less than that, close to $200,000 maximum. His father-in-law buys the gem for about $190,000, and then Arno's goons really kick the shit out of him. They break his nose. They hit him in his voice box or whatever. And he's just limping home with this gem that he's taken down from his father-in-law. He's walking home, and here he is with Jules in his shop, kind of at his wit's end.
Hey, sorry to bother you.
What is it?
I just wanted to see how the auction went.
Terrible. I don't want to talk about it.
Okay, well, Damien and Joseph brought this amazing sweatsuit that I think would look so nice on you. Do you want to see it?
Just leave me alone, please.
Come on, Howard.
Don't look at me.
Oh my God, Howard.
Don't look at me.
What the fuck happened to you?
Don't look at me, please. I don't know what I'm thinking. I don't know. Everybody's not ever going right.
I know.
I'm so sad. I'm so fucked up.
Yeah, I'm really upset too. I'm sorry if this has anything to do with me, but I swear I really didn't do anything.
I wish you were nicer to me, though. It was not nice what you did to me.
I try, but it's really hard.
I don't know what to do. I don't have any place to go. I don't have anywhere to get better.
But you do. Really, Howard. You're my home. You could come to me.
I can't figure it out. I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do. Everything I do is not going right. Everything I do is not going right. I don't know what to do. I really don't. I don't want any more of this shit. I really don't. I gotta figure this out. I really do.
Howard is just like breaking down in front of Jules and really showing his true colors. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah. Where finally all the weight of the world has finally crushed Howard and he's just falling apart.
Well, just one thing I think is so great about that scene is because the heel turn comes very suddenly, because I think he gets a call, from Kevin Garnett's agent or his representative, and who says that he's actually interested in still buying the opal, even though, they sort of outbid him accidentally at the auction. And it's just the way that his entire disposition changes immediately. And he doesn't wallow in this. And he's just, like we said before, just sort of looking ahead at the next prize, and he has his way out and he's just back on the move. It's like in a movie that is just so, action packed and sort of fast paced. It lets you slow down for a couple of minutes, but as soon as there's an out, it's going to take it. And, you're right back in the roller coaster again.
Yeah, it is. It is very interesting how his body language and his confidence and everything in pursuit of the next fix. He's like an addict, so
absolutely
when the next thing comes up. And so what happens is, Kevin Garnett buys the stone. He comes to pick it up. They have that chat that we played earlier. Howard places this insane 6-way parlay. I don't even know what that means, but essentially he places this very, very, very hard to pull off bet.
A lot of things have to happen,
including the Celtics winning the tip and Kevin Garnett getting a certain amount of points throughout the game. And so what happens is Arno's gang come for a final showdown, and he talks to them and he locks them in his double door entrance thing, which is like a recurring gag throughout the movie. Just another opportunity to inject some like low-hanging fruit humor. People yanking on the door, trying to buzz, it's not working,
Yep.
And they eventually put like a file in there, some sort of rasp to kind of like keep the door open. And so he's got the thugs in that room. They are not looking very happy, but he's watching the Celtics game where he's placed this insane bet. He sends Julia off in a helicopter to the Mohegan Sun Casino in Connecticut. She places this 6-way parlay bet with, what is it, $175,000, something like that.
I know it'll net them $1.2 million if it hits.
Yeah.
That's the big win.
Yeah. And she meets this colorful character named Wayne Diamond, or that's the actor, but his name is Wayne. And he seems like a harmless guy,
mostly,
but a colorful Jewish character. So he kind of helps Julia out and he keeps her company while Arno's thugs make it up to the casino. And then he ends of the film as a kind of like he does a little mitzvah, he doesn't have to do anything for, there's no reason for him. He says, I have more money than I know what to do with, so I come here all the time. Jules shares a helicopter with Wayne on the way up to Connecticut. So that's how they initially met. And he's just this real old pervy kind of guy, but sort of harmless, the kind of old man flirtation, I should say. One of these old, Wayne does these like sort of old man flirtations that are not acceptable in today's, in 2020 or 2019. Yeah. Right. I guess the film takes place in 2012, I believe.
I think so.
Anyway, not appropriate at any point. But at the end of the movie, he ends up carrying her $1.2 million out and gives it to Jules in the limousine. Yeah. Do you want to close it out and tell us how the film ends?
Yeah. So the film sort of tricks you into believing that this is all going to work out for Howard. He kind of gets this big win. He wins $1.2 million, which should be more than enough to pay off all his debts and, retire and happily. And of course, we know that if given the chance, he probably would have gambled that someplace else. But at least there's going to be a moment where, hopefully it's enough money that this could actually keep him afloat. And sort of in his euphoria, he unlocks the door and like lets the thugs come into the room with him to kind of say, I got you your money. This is what you always wanted. But, as we've been saying throughout, he never really looks at people, he never understands what they're going through. He doesn't recognize the fact that, the thugs sitting in that room weren't just waiting to see if he won the money and that they would get paid. Like they were visibly annoyed. They were trapped in this, confined space. It was clearly very hot in there, cut off from the air conditioning. They're all kind of like sweating down. And one of the particularly aggressive thugs who we know from earlier actually has a gun, on him because he had pulled it out. as soon as Howard opens the door to let him out, he kind of raises his arm and shoots him in the face, kind of instantly.
Yeah.
You know, exactly. Right under the eye. And I think Howard doesn't even have a moment to react because he's kind of already dead right away. And, you know, us, along with some of the other thugs that are with him, are kind of stuck in this place of shock that escalated beyond where anyone thought it might. And in the sort of panic, you know, that lead thug kind of kills one of the other ones that's with him and then, you know, cleans out the shop, basically steals what he can and, you know, makes his getaway. And the movie kind of ends. We see Howard alone on the floor, and much in the same way the movie began with us pulling out of his colon, we kind of re-enter into his body through the gunshot wound, you know, in his face, and kind of find ourselves in the middle of the opal, it seems, yes. You know, at some point in a very poetic finish.
Yeah, we're kind of right back where we started. And, you know, I wonder what that means, you know, to kind of end where we started in terms of things are certainly different than when we first came out of Howard's colon, so to speak. You know, we found Howard at his worst, you know, at the beginning, but then now he's dead. So in a sense, maybe he's better off. Like he's away, he's at peace, and Jules has all this money. What Jules is going to do with the money, I don't know. Like the thug, I think his name is Phil. He killed Arno as well in a haste, who's I thought was his boss. So that's kind of a weird choice. But then nothing really seems to happen. And they just, like you said, they start looting the place. So, you know, what happens with all that money? What happens with Jules? We'll never know. As we kind of come around to the end of the film, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. And we're back. Welcome back to Jews on Film. We are discussing Uncut Gems, the Safdie brothers 2019 film starring Adam Sandler. And so now that we just talked about a lot of things, let's talk about how we felt about it. We'll rate it on 1 to 5 Jewish stars in terms of themes, in terms of content, in terms of cast of characters, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, and then just give an overall rating. So do you want to kick it off, Harry?
Sure. I'll start us off, you know, the least controversial, the most obvious one, you know, how Jewish was this film in terms of its construction, you know, behind the camera, in front of it. And I would say that this is actually pretty high up, you know, for a film that, you know, as we went through, it doesn't have many Jewish, you know, characters involved, Jewish actors involved. I mean, at its lead is Adam Sandler, who is, you know, a very, you know, not only is he Jewish, I would say he's, you know, of the sort of mainstream comedic and otherwise actors, he is sort of visibly, you know, Jewish, and not in an, I mean, aesthetic sense. I mean, in the sense that, you know, he's famous for his Hanukkah song that he's recorded, and that's kind of become a part of his, you know, identity. His brand has been this sort of Jewish idea. So I think, you know, even in, you know, other of his films that might not be as explicitly Jewish, he is the kind of character, the kind of actor that brings with him a bit of a Jewish sensibility. So I think in that sense, I would definitely give it marks for being, you know, Jewish. And then, as we mentioned, you know, the Safdie brothers are this pair of, you know, Sephardic brothers. I think they grew up in New York, and, you know, they clearly, you know, wear that with them. I'm not sure how present it is in all of their films. I haven't seen most of their other films, but, you know, I've read in interviews, and you could just get a sense this was coming from a place of personal experience. We want to tell this Jewish story. I actually saw that they based the character of Howard off of a boss that their father had when he was working, you know, as a Jew in the Diamond District, you know, however many years ago. And he actually had a boss named Howard. And this kind of was very close to home in that sense of being part of this, you know, Diamond District, very Jewish world. So I'd say between the Safdie brothers and Adam Sandler, you know, even to the exclusion of most other people in the film that might not necessarily Jewish, I think because they're the center of this film, that carries a lot of Jewishness with it. And I think I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 stars of David for my how Jewish is the, you know, context, the creation of the film. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Safdie brothers are Jewish. They're Adam Sandler, as you mentioned. I would probably, you know, besides Adam Sandler, the cast and crew, I would probably give it like a 3.5. I mean, you know, he's certainly a Jewish presence in the film, and we'll get into this more in the thematic side. But as far as the Safdies being Jewish, that gives it probably 2.5. Him being in the film, Sandler, gives me another star. I would say if it was like an all Jewish cast, I might go closer to 5 stars. But there's a very us and them kind of thing, where like there are the Jews of the Diamond District, and then there are those who are the others, whether it's Kevin Garnett or Damani or Arno, or there's just an othering, and Jules as well. Like very clearly, you know who's who, but it's not an all Jewish cast. So I'll probably go like 3.5 stars.
Yeah. Well, that's fair. Similar to my pick, but I get why you went a little bit less Jewish than I thought it was. I want to ask you now to start us off on the next one. I want to save themes for last. I want to save themes actually, because I think that's where we'll have an interesting discussion about how thematically Jewish this film is. But just in terms of the plot, and I think you could go both ways on this, but would you say, this, like the plot of this film made it a very Jewish film?
I'm going to have to save my stars for the theme. I feel like the plot of the film, the setting is Jewish, the character is Jewish, but it's not really, it's a biblical tale in some regard, but we'll get into that in theme. I would say, I don't think it's a very highly Jewish film in that regard. It has an homage to a Seder and it has other things here and there, but the plot itself is not strictly Jewish. I'd maybe give it like a 1.5 stars or something like that.
Wow. Yeah. You know what? I went back and forth on this one. I had some interesting thoughts about, how Jewish it is. Because on one end, I agree with you, the story, the kind of the overarching, to summarize the story about a gambler who, throws away his money, is trying to win big on this big thing. Like, I think from a removed perspective, it doesn't necessarily feel like a Jewish story. This isn't something that's reminds me of any of the, sort of Jewish parables, we've learned growing up, or any of the biblical stories. This feels like its own story, but at as much as I'm tempted to give it, a very low ranking here, I haven't seen a movie that has this much Jewishness in it, even if it is like less the plot and more the characters, and just how so identifiably Jewish Howard is. And just the fact that they have, this Passover Seder, as this central component of a film, like that is just so true to, a Jewish experience that I just have never seen like this in a film. And the amount of times that I had this sort of running list of, where something Jewish is referenced, or where some character is referred to as a Jew, or where, characters in the Diamond District absentmindedly, say things to each other, Happy Pesach or something Jewish like that, to me just felt like, if I'm not going to give a high ranking to this film, I don't know what's going to cut it, because that really felt so Jewish to me. So I'm not going to go all the way up to 5, but I think maybe 3.5 out of 5, stars of David for, how Jewish is the actual plot of this film.
I might push back and say that you, like Peter Parker, have a spidey sense for Jewish things, and like the average non-Jewish viewer, or a viewer who may not be as well versed in things, may just think that that's a meal where they like read from a book. I don't know. These are throwaway lines. How was your Pesach? Or have a good Pesach. I don't know. If Howard was a rabbi and it was like the jazz singer, which we may cover at some point, where like he's like a cantor's son and he has to like either play piano or be like that's a very Jewish movie in terms of plot, because its center focus is all about Judaism in the shul context and whatever. You didn't think we'd go to jazz singer today, huh? But this is just like a jeweler who runs through a string of bad luck, and I don't see what is Jewish about the plot. Now, theme, which we can get to in a second, I would say is way more Jewish, but I want to talk to you about what you thought about the theme in terms of a 1 to 5, stars of David. Thematically, how Jewish did you feel this film was?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, just to what you were saying before, honestly, I'll take criticism. That's a fair point in terms of gauging, how much did I pick up on versus how much did others. And I almost would say that, maybe to use what you were throwing against me to strengthen my point, I think more so than a much more subtly Jewish film, I think anyone watching this would say there's something going on with Jews. There's a lot of yarmulkes flying around. There's a lot of, people talking a certain way, like we're having this Passover Seder. And I agree with you. That's why this movie is so difficult, because somehow it is so grounded in a Jewish world, but also doesn't actually, the Jewishness isn't necessarily driving the plot, which is just such a weird balance. So, for the sake of, of agreeing with you a little bit here, I'll lower my ranking down from 3.5 to 3 to just 3 whole, stars of David. That's my gift offering to you. I hope I hope it's enough.
Yeah, sure. I wasn't asking for your 0.5 star, but I'll take it. I really appreciate it.
It's my gift to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. It's like one of these like Marvel Easter eggs where like, if you've read the comics before, then that character in the background is a secret character from Guardians of the Galaxy, whatever. It's like one of these things where it's not central to the story that it has to be a Seder and you have to know what that is, or you have to know what Pesach is or whatever. So that's what I'm saying. But I certainly will take your 0.5 star and I'll put it in my pocket and I'll save it for later. Because, But thematically, how do you think this film stacks up 1 to 5 stars of David?
Yeah. I mean, that's the big question. That's why I was excited to do this category last. And I think similar to what we were saying about the plot sort of not being driven by, Jewish ideas, I was thinking of that thematically. And I think probably before we had this discussion, I would have given it a very, very low score, because I really do think that, the themes of this movie about, sort of gambling and being into too far, over your head and not being present in the moment and, always just sort of looking for the next fix and risking everything. There is nothing that feels so inherently Jewish to me about that. But I don't know. I think our conversation about what we were talking about, the sort of Passover at the center of this and that dynamic of, poverty to riches and, the way that plays into the biblical themes of, Passover. But even beyond that, to just, I guess I did like themes of sort of generational, poverty that Jews have experienced and sort of coming to, the United States and kind of cultivating, wealth for the first time, including in the Diamond District, which is obviously such a big part of this film. I am starting to see a little bit more resonance there. I think the movie's resolutions don't necessarily support those themes. It doesn't really turn into this Jewish thematic lesson. Here's why you should, embrace, your Jewishness and God and save the day. It doesn't resolve as cleanly as I would like, but I think it's more Jewish than I expected. So still not going to give it such a strong one. I think I'm going to go 2.5 stars of David. So a little bit of like in the midpoint, and that's up from my, 1 star that I was thinking originally when we were discussing this. But yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle, around 2.5. How about you?
Did you want your half star back in case for later? Save it for later?
You know what? Save it for another episode. There's going to be another episode down the line where maybe we're split on a movie and I'm going to need that advantage, just to help me. So just remember that.
I mean, for me, this thematically, like the more that we're talking about it and chopping it up, it's just a very biblical film to me, right? Like all this shitty stuff happens to this character. He's not very likable as a character. And who ends up winning in the end, right? Like in a lot of biblical tales, the Jews don't win, right? The non-Jews win. And so who wins? Jules gets her money. She's very not Jewish in the film. Like they make a point of pointing that out. Arno, who's like, technically he's in the family sort of, and he doesn't win. So Arno's thugs get the money. Kevin Garnett gets the stone. So really like the Jews don't win in this film at all. And that's very biblical, but like the pursuit of wealth, there's just a lot to tackle here. I feel like, and then also the humor, I feel like that humor element is a very Jewish thing. The way that the jokes are told, they're not these like big, broad jokes. They kind of like subtle. Yeah. And a lot about it, I think, haggling, there's a lot of stereotypes around. And I think the Safdies have kind of like leaned into the stereotypes a bit. So I'm going to go like 4.5 stars, something like that.
Wow. 4.5.
Maybe I'll go 4. I'll say that like a half star,
Exactly.
But, yeah, I do feel like it's a pretty thematically Jewish film. Plot wise, not as much, but yeah. Do you want to go ahead and we'll talk about our overall rating of the film? How much we enjoyed it? Sure.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I mean, one way we can kind of gauge our overall Jewishness ranking of the film is just by calculating the average of, our scores. But I think I threw too many halves in there that I'm not going to spend some time now trying to figure that all out. But I definitely think, overall, just sort of watching it, and I'm just trying to gauge now, how much did I feel like this was a Jewish movie versus how much was this another movie that, like we were talking about before, happened to have some throwaway, gags to being Jewish. And it's certainly changed between my two viewings. I think the first time I watched it, I remembered that he was a Jewish character. I remembered, maybe seeing him as Zuzah or Yarmulke, every once in a while. But like what stayed with me from that first viewing of the film was just, the devastation at the end, the kind of self-destruction of the character, which just didn't feel to me as sort of resonantly Jewish. But certainly watching it through this lens and through the lens of recording it for this podcast, it just felt like I couldn't get it out of my head. I was like, I haven't seen a movie this sort of explicitly Jewish, that is dealing with Jewish characters and not, dumbing them down. I'll give a minor spoiler for Licorice Pizza, the Paul Thomas Anderson movie that came out a couple of days ago, although I can hold it to myself if you don't want me to spoil it. I mean, it is so minor. It was just a moment where they had, Jewish characters in the film. And there's this kind of thing where it's like, you see it in a lot of Jewish films or films that are trying to present Jews where they'll sing, like the Friday Night Kiddush song and like some tune. And in this case, they used the Hanukkah tune, the Hanukkah candle lighting tune for like the Shabbos one. And it just felt wrong. It felt like they were going with the most cinematic version of a Jewish table they could. And what was so striking about watching Uncut Gems, especially after seeing that, was it didn't feel like this movie was trying to explain it. They weren't trying to dumb it down and make it more, accessible or, cinematic. It was just like these characters were just Jewish and they were doing, the Seder wasn't like this big event. It was just like, that's what they were doing that night. It happened to be that weekend. And I just thought that was really cool. And that was really, very Jewish in a way that I haven't seen so much in a mainstream film. So in terms of this being, a Jewish film, I don't think it's, 5 stars in the way, something much more explicitly, like a Schindler's List, not spoiling that episode, but in a way that movie might be.
Sure.
But I'm going to go 4 stars of David. I'm going to say this actually really was, despite my lower rankings for some of the other categories, this really was a Jewish film. So I'm going to go 4 stars. How about you?
I was just going to rate it kind of on like how much I liked it on a scale of 1 to 5, but I like the idea of like, how Jewish of a film it is. I will say that like, after seeing this film, I went to my cardiologist and he said, don't watch this film for like another 2 years. Cause like, it's just too much stress on my heart.
Agreed.
Yeah. Very, very high intensity film, but highly recommended if you haven't seen it. But yeah, I'll probably give it like a 3.5 stars in terms of like how Jewish the film is overall, both thematically, plot wise, and dealing with the cast and crew of the film. So definite watch from me for sure. If you haven't seen it. And if you have seen it, I would suggest rewatching it after listening to this podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thanks for tuning in. Feel free to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film. And, if there's any films that you want to suggest to us that we may not have heard of, please do so. Harry, good to talk to you, man.
Great to talk to you as always.
I got to tell you a little bit after the podcast about this really cool 6-way parlay that I'm thinking about betting at the Mohegan Sun. Maybe you could throw in some cash for me.
I think I'm going to stay out of this one, but
we're going to hit big, Harry. I'm telling you, man.
I don't know.
Okay. All right, man. Take it easy.
You too.
Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Daniel Zana and Harry Ottensaucer. Daniel Zana edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.